They said it was an accident, a car lost to rain, a cliff that didn't forgive, a file closed too quickly to ask questions. But a brother trained to survive war knows when silence is manufactured, and he knows when fear has fingerprints. He came home to sell a house that was never meant to be sold, to face a woman holding her breath inside her own skin, and to meet a German shepherd who did not wag, did not greet, only guarded. Dogs don't protect lies. They protect what still matters. And when a loyal animal refuses to move, it's not because of instinct alone, but because something unfinished is still waiting to be seen. This is not a story about death. It's about what love chooses to carry in silence, and what God allows to surface when the truth has waited long enough. Stay with us. Like the video, subscribe to Silent Paws Steady Hearts, and help us reach our first 1,000 subscribers, so more quiet truths like this can be told. Caleb Vance learned about the sale from a third party, which was the first wrong note. A forwarded listing link, sent without comment by a former neighbor who still used his mother's old email address out of habit. The house appeared on the screen like a trespasser wearing a familiar face. Cedar siding, weathered silver by salt air. A sloped roof reinforced against coastal storms. The narrow strip of land that ended abruptly in rock and sea. The price was fair. The description was clean. Too clean. Caleb sat alone in a rented apartment thousands of miles away, the phone warm in his hand, and felt a pressure behind his eyes that had nothing to do with fatigue. Owen would never have done this. Not that house. Not after the vow he'd made years ago, pale and thinner than he'd ever been, when illness had hollowed him out and forced him to confront the possibility of leaving things unfinished. Owen had said it plainly then, voice rough but certain, that the house would never be sold. Not for money, not for relief, not even if it became the last thing he had the strength to protect. Caleb knew vows like that. He knew which ones bent and which ones didn't. He called immediately. The line rang longer than it should have before Owen picked up, his voice lower than Caleb remembered, stretched thin like a wire pulled too tight. Owen spoke carefully, choosing words as if someone else might be counting them. He said the market was good. He said things change. He said he was tired. When Caleb pressed, asking what had really happened, Owen paused just long enough for the silence to bruise. "Don't come back," Owen said suddenly. The words slipped out sharp, unbuffered, like a blade breaking through cloth. Then, softer, almost apologetic. "I've got it handled." The call ended moments later, not with resolution but with absence. Caleb spent the following weeks in a state he would later recognize as denial. He told himself there were explanations. Medical bills, pressure, fear. He told himself that Owen was an adult who could make his own decisions, even bad ones. It was easier to accept that than to admit something else was moving beneath the surface, something that required attention he was not yet ready to give. 3 months later, the explanation arrived, wrapped in official language. Owen Vance was dead. A car accident, they said. Rain-slick road, loss of control. The vehicle had gone over the edge, near the old cliff road that hugged the coast like a scar. No signs of braking, no signs of struggle. Cameras in the area had malfunctioned during the storm. Witnesses were few and uncertain. The report closed itself neatly, like a file designed to be shelved rather than read. Caleb read it twice, then a third time, the way he used to reread mission summaries when something didn't sit right. The conclusions were too smooth, the edges too sanded down. Accidents left mess. This left none. He flew back within 48 hours. The town had not changed in any meaningful way. Same narrow streets, same wind that carried salt and rust in equal measure. The house stood where it always had, stubborn against the elements, its windows dark, its posture unchanged. Caleb parked and remained in the truck for a long moment, hands on the wheel, breathing in a pattern his body remembered even if his mind resisted it. Mara Vance opened the door before he knocked. She was younger than Caleb by several years, slight in build, her shoulders drawn inward as if she were bracing against a cold that lived inside rather than out. Her hair, dark brown and worn loose to her shoulders, had been hastily tucked behind one ear, strands already escaping. Her skin was pale in a way that spoke of sleepless nights, not lack of sun. When she met Caleb's eyes, she tried to smile. It didn't reach them. "I'm glad you're here," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her, fingers curling and uncurling at her sides as if she were gripping something invisible. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old wood, too orderly, as though chaos had been scrubbed away with effort rather than time. Mara moved through the space with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to take up as little room as possible. She spoke about arrangements, about paperwork, about how hard the storm had been that night. She did not speak about Owen, unless Caleb asked, and even then, only in short, careful sentences. Coda appeared in the doorway, leading to the back of the house. The German Shepherd was large, 6 or 7 years old, his frame powerful but balanced, the kind of strength that came from work rather than show. His coat was thick, black along the back and shoulders, fading into warm tan along the chest and legs. His ears stood erect, angled forward, his dark eyes alert, but not frantic. He did not rush Caleb. He did not wag. Instead, Coda stepped between Caleb and the narrow hallway that led to the storage shed near the cliff, planting his paws and lifting his head just enough to block passage. His body was rigid, not aggressive, watchful. Caleb recognized the posture instantly. It was the stance of a sentry, not a guard dog reacting to threat, but a trained animal holding a line because something on the other side mattered. "He's been like that," Mara said quietly, noticing Caleb's attention. Ever since, Caleb crouched slowly, meeting Coda at eye level. The dog's gaze flicked to him, assessing, then returned to the closed door. No fear, no confusion, just purpose. "He's not scared," Caleb said, more to himself than to Mara. "He's keeping something." The first night passed in fragments. Wind rattled the windows, the sea muttered below the cliffs. Caleb lay awake in his childhood room, staring at the ceiling, cataloging every inconsistency he could recall. Owen's voice on the phone, the speed of the investigation, the listing that had appeared too early, too prepared. Near midnight, a sound slid beneath the door. It was soft, almost polite, paper against wood. Caleb was on his feet before he fully understood why. He opened the door and found a plain white envelope resting on the floor, unmarked, its edges crisp. Inside, a single sheet of paper bore a short message, typed, impersonal, "Don't let the past be dug up." Behind him, Coda stood close, his back fur slightly raised, a low vibration humming in his chest. Not a growl, a warning. Caleb closed his fingers around the note, feeling the weight of it settle somewhere deep in his gut. This was not grief speaking. This was not coincidence. This was a line drawn. And the dog, steady and unyielding at his side, was telling him without words that crossing it would change everything. Morning arrived without lightness. The coastal fog clung to the house as if it had been summoned, pressing against windows, dulling sound, softening edges in a way that made everything feel provisional. Caleb woke early, the habit ingrained too deeply to undo, and lay still for a moment listening to the house breathe. Wood expanded and contracted with the cold. Somewhere down the hall, Coda shifted, nails clicking once against the floor before settling again. Fear had a rhythm, Caleb knew, and a smell. It was faint, but unmistakable, woven into the air of the kitchen when he stepped inside. Something sharp beneath the cleaner, beneath the salt, beneath the coffee Mara had already poured but not touched. It was the scent of someone bracing for impact. Mara sat at the small table by the window, hands wrapped around the mug as if warmth might anchor her. In daylight, she looked more fragile than she had the night before. Her shoulders sloped inward, not from weakness, but from a long practice of making herself smaller. The skin beneath her eyes carried a faint shadow, the kind left by nights spent rehearsing explanations that never quite worked. She lifted her gaze when Caleb entered, and for a fraction of a second, relief crossed her face, then vanished, replaced by caution. "I can make more," she said, gesturing toward the pot, her voice careful, measured. "I'm fine," Caleb replied, taking the opposite chair. He did not sit immediately. He looked around instead, noting what had changed since his childhood and what had not. The same cabinets, the same scuffed floor near the sink. But on the counter lay a thin stack of papers, edges aligned too neatly. Legal documents had a way of announcing themselves to those who knew how to listen. Mara followed his gaze and stiffened. "They came by last month," she said quickly. "Before the accident." "Who did?" Caleb asked. She hesitated, then reached for the papers and slid them across the table with fingers that trembled despite her effort to steady them. The top page bore a letterhead Caleb did not recognize, the font overly modern for the town. The address, a rented suite 2 counties away. The language beneath was dense, technical, and deliberately urgent. Claims, liabilities, a dispute over land boundaries tied to old easements and environmental fines, penalties that escalated by the week. Caleb read in silence, his jaw tightening. "This isn't a sale," he said finally. "It's a squeeze." Mara swallowed. "They said if we didn't resolve it quickly, they'd take the house anyway, that we'd be ruined." "Who was the lawyer?" Caleb asked. "I never met him," she replied. "Just emails, calls, always rushed." Caleb's finger traced the signature line. Owen's name sat there, but something about it was off. The pressure inconsistent, the letters slightly skewed. "They rushed him," Caleb said. "They boxed him in." Mara's breath hitched, the sound sharp and involuntary. She stared at the tabletop, then nodded once, as if conceding something she had fought to keep buried. "There's more," she said quietly. She did not look up when she spoke next. She spoke to the space between them, to the years that had preceded this house, this town, this version of herself. "I wasn't always who you think I am," Mara said. "Before Owen." Her voice did not waver, but her hands tightened until her knuckles blanched. She told him about the city she'd left behind, about the choices made when survival narrowed into a single lane, about nights that blurred together and names that never mattered. She did not dress it up or dramatize it. She spoke plainly, as someone long past denial. When she met Owen, she said, she had already wanted out. He had not rescued her. He had simply believed her when she said she was done. "He knew?" Caleb asked. Mara shook her head. "Not everything, but enough. And he never asked for details. The people who had contacted her knew," she explained. "They had found old records, old connections. They had threatened to send everything to her employer, to the church down the road where Owen volunteered, to anyone who might listen in a town that remembered too well and forgave too slowly. They had promised to make Owen collateral if she resisted. They said the house would cover it," she whispered. "That if we sold quietly, it would all go away." Caleb leaned back, the chair creaking softly. He had seen this pattern before. Though never dressed in coastal paperwork and small-town politeness, pressure applied where it hurt most. Love turned into leverage. "If it was just money," he said slowly, "why did he tell me not to come back?" Mara's silence stretched. Coda rose from his spot near the doorway and crossed the kitchen, stopping beside Caleb's chair. The dog's posture was alert, ears forward, eyes fixed not on Mara, but on the narrow hall leading toward the storage shed. He whined softly, then turned his head, looking back at Caleb with an intensity that felt deliberate. "He's been doing that all morning," Mara said, her voice barely audible. "Like he wants someone to follow him." Caleb met the dog's gaze. In the field, Coda had been trained to read environments, to mark changes others missed. Dogs didn't lie. They responded. "All right," Caleb murmured. He stood, but before he could move toward the hall, Mara's phone buzzed on the counter. She flinched as if struck. The screen lit up with a blocked number. "I need to take this," she said quickly, already backing away. "Please." Caleb watched her retreat into the kitchen alcove, the thin wall doing nothing to muffle sound. He did not intend to listen. He could not help it. Her voice dropped, tight with strain. "I did exactly what you asked," Mara said. "I signed what you sent. I told him what to say." A pause. Caleb could hear her breathing. "No," she whispered. "You said you wouldn't hurt him." The words landed with a dull finality, like a blade finding wood. Coda let out a low, sustained sound, not loud enough to alert, but deep enough to vibrate through the floor. Caleb stood frozen, the pieces aligning with brutal clarity. Owen's fear, the rush, the warning. Mara emerged moments later, her face pale, her eyes bright with unshed tears she refused to release. She avoided Caleb's gaze, moving past him as if gravity had shifted. "I'm sorry," she said, not looking back. Caleb remained where he was, the smell of fear sharp now, undeniable. This was no longer a matter of suspicion. It was a matter of timing. And whatever had happened on that cliff road had not been an accident. Dr. Junehart's clinic sat at the edge of town, where the pavement thinned into gravel and the air smelled faintly of iodine and wet fur. It was a modest building, paint sun-faded, windows clean, a place built for function rather than reassurance. Caleb arrived mid-morning, Coda pacing beside him with a patience that looked earned rather than trained. The dog paused at the door, nose lifting as if cataloging a history written in sense alone. Then followed Caleb inside without hesitation. Junehart looked up from the counter where she was labeling vials. She was in her early 40s, tall and compact, her posture upright in the way of someone who had spent years bending over emergencies without letting them bend her back. Her hair, dark blonde threaded with lighter strands, was pulled into a practical knot that kept it off her face. Her eyes, pale and steady, took in Caleb and Coda in a single, efficient sweep. There was nothing soft about her expression, but there was nothing unkind either. It was the look of a professional who trusted patterns more than promises. "Coda," she said, her voice calm, recognizing the dog immediately. She crouched, extending a hand not to touch but to greet. Coda stepped forward, sniffed once, and allowed a brief scratch beneath the chin. No excitement. Recognition. June straightened and turned to Caleb. "You're Owen's brother," she said. It wasn't a question. Caleb nodded. "Caleb Vance." "I'm sorry," she replied, simply, as if adding more would dilute the meaning. "I wondered when you'd come." She motioned them into the back room, where the walls bore charts of anatomy and the faint scars of long use. The examination table was clean, the metal surface reflecting light without glare. June leaned against the counter, arms crossed loosely, waiting. She did not rush him. People who had worked emergencies learned when silence did more than questions. "I need to know about the last time you saw my brother," Caleb said. "And about Coda." June's gaze flicked briefly to the dog, then returned to Caleb. "I figured you would." She told him it had been 3 weeks before Owen died. Owen had brought Coda in for what he claimed was a routine check. The dog was healthy. Older, yes, but steady. What June noticed was Owen. He had been thinner than his record suggested, his shoulders tense, his movements guarded. When he'd bent to hold Coda steady, His jacket had ridden up just enough to expose bruising along his ribs. Not the diffuse pattern of a fall, not the irregular bloom of an accident. These were clustered, controlled. The marks of pressure. I asked him, June said. He said he'd slipped carrying lumber. Her mouth tightened slightly. I didn't believe him. She described how Owen's hands had trembled, not constantly, but at odd moments, as if responding to something remembered rather than present. How his eyes tracked the door whenever a car passed outside. How he had asked a question that did not belong in a veterinary clinic. He asked me, June continued, her voice steady, if someone died on a road like that, near the cliffs, would they call it an accident by default? Caleb felt the room contract around him. I told him what they usually do, June said, and he nodded, like he was confirming a hypothesis. She moved to a drawer beneath the counter and pulled it open, retrieving a small cloth pouch. From it, she removed a piece of driftwood, no longer than Caleb's palm. The surface was smoothed by water and time, but etched into it were shallow, deliberate lines forming a familiar pattern. A constellation. Caleb's breath caught. His father had carved the same pattern years ago, teaching the boys how to find their way home by the stars when the power went out and the world went dark. It had been their code, their reminder. Owen left this, June said. He asked me to keep it safe. He said if you came back, I'd know. She hesitated, then added, he also said Coda would know where to go. Caleb took the wood, the grain warm from June's hand. Coda stepped closer, nose brushing the carving once, then again. The dog's posture changed. Not tense, not excited, but purposeful. He turned toward the door and waited. Caleb's pulse quickened. He thanked June the words inadequate but sincere and followed Coda back into the light. They did not return directly to the house. Coda led him along a narrow path, skirting the property line. The dog's pace, unhurried but unwavering. The air shifted as they approached the old storage shed near the cliff, a structure Caleb remembered from childhood as a place for nets and tools, nothing more. Now, it stood weather-beaten, its door warped, the ground around it uneven with disuse. Coda stopped. He planted himself in front of the shed's sidewall, not the door, and looked back at Caleb. The dog's ears were forward, his body angled slightly, as if aligning himself with something unseen. Caleb knelt, pressing the carved wood against the boards. The grain hummed faintly beneath his palm, not with sound, but with recognition. This was the moment that lodged beneath Caleb's ribs and refused to leave. Not revelation, exactly, but alignment. The sense that he was standing where he had been, meant to stand all along. He did not open the shed. Not yet. Instead, he marked the spot in his mind and returned to the house with questions sharpening into intent. That afternoon, he drove back into town, the driftwood heavy in his pocket. June's final words followed him like a map half unfurled. There's someone else, she had said, someone who knows the land and knows when to keep his mouth shut. She had given him a name, Elias Whitaker. Caleb found Whitaker where June said he would, near the ranger station at the edge of the coastal reserve. The man was in his late 50s, broad through the chest, compact rather than tall. His face was carved by years of wind and sun, a thick mustache shading a mouth that looked set in permanent consideration. His uniform was worn but clean, boots scuffed by miles rather than neglect. When he saw Caleb approach, his eyes narrowed slightly, not in hostility, but in assessment. You Owen's brother, Whitaker said, echoing June's certainty. Caleb nodded. I hear you know this land. Whitaker's gaze flicked to Coda, who stood quietly at Caleb's side. Something like recognition passed between them. The ranger exhaled slowly. Owen asked me once, Whitaker said, what gets written down and what doesn't? And what did you tell him? Caleb asked. That not everything needs a report, Whitaker replied. Some things need time. He did not say more. He did not need to. The implications settled like a stone in water, slow, inevitable. As Caleb turned to leave, Whitaker added, "If you're looking for answers, watch where the dog stops. Animals don't argue with themselves." That night, Caleb stood again by the shed, the constellation wood in his hand. Coda sat beside him, eyes fixed, patient. Whatever lay beneath that place had been waiting, not for permission, but for the right witness. And Caleb understood, with a clarity that burned, that Owen had trusted a healer to keep the truth intact until it could no longer be ignored. The shed had always been there, which was why no one ever really saw it. It crouched near the edge of the property where the land narrowed and the ground sloped toward the cliff, its weather-beaten boards dulled by salt air and neglect. As a child, Caleb remembered it as a place of little consequence, a catch-all for nets, rusted tools, things no one needed often enough to care about. Now, standing before it as a man shaped by war and loss, he understood why Owen had chosen it. Things meant to endure were rarely placed at the center of attention. Coda reached the shed first. The German shepherd moved with deliberate calm, his powerful frame steady despite the uneven ground. His coat, black along the spine and fading to warm tan at the legs and chest, was dusted with salt and grit carried up from the sea. He paused at the threshold, nostrils flaring once, then stepped inside without hesitation. The interior smelled of damp wood and iron. Light filtered in through gaps in the planks, striping the floor in narrow bands. Caleb scanned the space instinctively, noting what did not belong as much as what did. The shelves were sparse, their contents arranged too neatly for a place meant to be forgotten. Someone had curated this emptiness. Coda moved to the back wall and stopped. He did not bark. He did not pace. He lifted one paw and scraped once, precise, restrained, against a single plank whose surface bore faint wear marks inconsistent with age alone. Human contact, repeated, intentional. Caleb knelt and pressed his fingers to the board. It gave slightly, not with rot, but with design. The nails were old, driven in at irregular angles, a common trick used to discourage curiosity. He pried it loose carefully, the wood releasing with a sigh of trapped air. Behind it lay a shallow cavity layered with dust and false debris, broken hinges, rusted screws, the kind of detritus meant to convince a casual searcher they'd reached the end of the story. Caleb brushed it aside and felt the edge of something solid beneath. A metal box. It was compact, rectangular, its surface scarred but intact. A waterproof seal ringed the lid, dulled by time but unbroken. Caleb lifted it free, the weight heavier than expected, and for a moment simply held it, aware of the way Coda's body shifted closer, the dog's attention sharpening. Inside the box were 4 items, each wrapped with care. A rubber-sealed USB drive. A folded land contract, its margins crowded with handwritten corrections and dates that didn't align, signatures pressed too hard in places where hesitation had been forced into speed. A small, old-fashioned key, its bow etched with a star. And a letter, folded once, the paper thick, the handwriting unmistakably Owen's. Caleb did not open the letter yet. He had learned long ago that timing mattered. He replaced the items and closed the lid, the seal clicking softly into place. He turned toward the door, and Coda stepped into his path. The dog's posture changed in an instant. His ears angled back slightly, his head lowered, body tense but controlled. He placed his shoulder against Caleb's thigh and applied pressure, guiding him backward. It was not panic. It was warning. Caleb froze. Through the narrow gap at the door, he saw movement. A vehicle parked farther up the road than any visitor would choose, its engine idling too quietly, too patiently. A shape behind the windshield shifted, then stilled. Someone was watching. Caleb did not reach for his phone. He did not open the door. He trusted the instincts that had kept him alive when maps failed and plans dissolved. Instead, he eased back, nodding once to Coda. "All right," he murmured. They waited. Wind rose suddenly, carrying rain in sharp bursts that rattled the shed walls and blurred sightlines. When the moment aligned, Caleb slipped out through the rear opening Owen had cut years earlier for hauling lumber, now just wide enough for a man and a dog moving as one. They circled wide, keeping low, the storm covering sound and scent. Caleb felt the box's weight in his pack like a heartbeat. By the time they reached the house, the road was empty again, as if it had never held a witness. Inside, Caleb set the box on the kitchen table and finally unfolded the letter. It was brief. Owen had never been one for excess. "If you're reading this, it means I guessed right. Don't trust what's obvious. Don't confront them. Use the key." Caleb exhaled slowly and picked up the star-etched key. He tested it on the box out of instinct. It did not fit. Coda, who had been watching from the doorway, turned his head toward the shed again, then back to Caleb, and let out a single, soft huff. Not impatience, direction. Caleb returned to the shed alone this time, the rain thinning to mist. He scanned the interior again with new eyes. The keyhole revealed itself not in wood but in stone, a narrow seam in the foundation where the shed met the cliff rock. He pressed the key in, felt resistance, then a subtle give. A second compartment opened. Inside were fewer items, but heavier in consequence. Photographs of the car Owen had driven, taken not after the crash, but before. Images of the undercarriage, the brake lines, one clamp newly replaced with hardware too clean for its surroundings. A receipt from a garage outside town. The name unfamiliar. The date stamped 2 days before the accident. Caleb stared at it, the rain cooling the back of his neck, the implications settling like ice in his chest. This was not panic. This was preparation. Owen had known, and someone else had made sure he wouldn't make it to the end of the road. Caleb waited until night to open the USB. The house had settled into a familiar quiet, the kind that came after a day of decisions that refused to announce themselves as such. Wind moved through the trees in steady breaths, and the sea beyond the cliffs kept its low, patient murmur. Coda lay near the table, his long body stretched out, head resting on his paws, eyes half-lidded, but not asleep. The dog had learned, like Caleb, that vigilance did not always look like motion. Caleb plugged the drive into his laptop and waited for the file to load. He did not brace himself. Bracing implied resistance. He needed none. Owen's voice came through the speakers unevenly, recorded in fragments that bore the mark of haste. There was background noise, footsteps, wind, the faint metallic rattle of keys. "If you're hearing this," Owen said, breath quick, words clipped, "it means I ran out of time." The voice paused, then resumed, lower now, as if he were moving. "They're not after the house for money," Owen continued. "They're after leverage. They found something on Mara. Old things. Things she thought were buried. They told her if she didn't cooperate, they'd tear her life open in ways this town would never forgive." A soft exhale, the sound of a door opening. "I tried to stall. I tried to fix it without pulling you into it," Owen said. "They told me if you came back, they'd make it worse. I believed them." Caleb's jaw tightened, but his hands remained steady. "They gave me dates," Owen went on. "Meetings, deadlines. Told me to follow the schedule and everything would end clean. I don't trust that. If you're listening, don't either." The recording cut abruptly. Caleb closed the laptop slowly, the room feeling smaller, the air heavier. He did not look at Mara right away. She sat across from him at the table, shoulders hunched, hands folded tightly in her lap as if holding herself together by force of will alone. Her hair was pulled back tonight, revealing the tense line of her jaw, the pallor beneath her skin more pronounced in the lamp's light. She had listened too. "I didn't know," she said finally. The words were barely audible. "Not that far." Caleb waited. Silence, he had learned, invited truth better than accusation. Mara swallowed and began to speak, her confession unfolding in halting segments, each one peeling away another layer of protection she had relied on for years. She named the men who had come to her first. Not directly, but through intermediaries who knew exactly how to reach her, land brokers with clean offices and practiced smiles. And behind them, a man from her past, whose name she had not spoken aloud since she left the city. A man who had once controlled her schedule, her income, her fear. "They said they just needed cooperation," she said, her voice shaking despite her effort to steady it. That if Owen sold quickly, signed what they put in front of him, everything else would disappear. She described the plan they had given her, step by step, delivered with the calm authority of people used to being obeyed. Owen was to drive out in the rain for an urgent signing. His car would be checked beforehand by a mechanic they recommended, someone who wouldn't ask questions. Mara was instructed not to mention any of it to Caleb, warned that a trained soldier brother would escalate things and put Owen in danger. "I thought it was just pressure," she whispered. "I thought it was paperwork. I didn't know they'd—" Her voice broke off, the sentence collapsing under its own weight. Caleb leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed on her face. He did not raise his voice. He did not move closer. "Do you know what my brother died from?" he asked. The question landed with surgical precision. Mara opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her eyes filled, but no words came. Her body seemed to fold inward, as if gravity had suddenly increased. Coda rose and crossed the room. The German shepherd stopped directly in front of Mara and sat. His posture was upright, balanced, his head level with her knees. He did not bare teeth. He did not whine. He looked at her with a steady, unblinking gaze that held neither cruelty nor comfort. It was the moment that held the room. Coda was not judging. He was insisting. Animals, Caleb knew, did not soften truth to spare feelings. They presented it and waited to see if you were capable of standing under its weight. Mara bowed her head, shoulders shaking silently. When she spoke again, it was with a rawness that stripped pretense from every word. "I killed him," she said. "Not with my hands, but with my silence." Caleb exhaled slowly, the sound measured, controlled. Rage would have been easier. Rage would have absolved him of thought. Instead, he felt something heavier settle in his chest. Responsibility, distributed unevenly, was still responsibility. "They lied to you," Caleb said, "and they used your fear to do it." Mara looked up at him, eyes red-rimmed, searching. "What are you going to do?" Caleb stood, walking to the window where the cliff road lay invisible in darkness. He thought of Owen, moving through those final days, calculating risk the way soldiers did, accepting danger if it bought someone else a chance. "I'm not turning this into revenge," Caleb said. "That would only finish what they started." He turned back to the table and reached for his phone. "There's a deputy in town," he continued. "Lila Grant. She doesn't like stories that wrap up too neatly." Mara stiffened. "The police closed it." "Closed doesn't mean correct," Caleb replied. "And I'm not asking them to believe me. I'm giving them something they can't ignore." He dialed, listening as the call rang. Deputy Lila Grant answered on the fourth ring, her voice brisk, edged with fatigue. Caleb introduced himself plainly, without embellishment. When he mentioned Owen's name, there was a pause on the line, brief but telling. "I read that file," Grant said. "Didn't like it." Caleb looked at Mara, then at Coda, who had resumed his place at Caleb's side. "I have evidence." Caleb said, "and a witness who needs protection more than judgment." Another pause, longer this time. "Tomorrow morning," Grant said. "My office. Bring everything." The call ended without ceremony. Caleb set the phone down and met Mara's gaze. "This stops being a private burden tonight," he said. "From here on out, it's handled in the open." Mara nodded, exhaustion washing over her features. For the first time since Caleb had arrived, something like relief flickered through her fear. Not absolution, but the possibility of fairness. Coda lay back down, head resting against Caleb's boot. The dog's eyes closed, not in indifference, but in trust. His work here was not finished, but it had found its direction. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the sound of waves striking stone. Caleb listened and understood that truth, once spoken aloud, did not heal anything by itself. But it did give the living a place to stand. Caleb did not open Owen's journal right away. It sat on the table where he had placed it the night before, wrapped in a faded oilcloth that still carried the faint scent of wood smoke and salt air. Morning light crept into the kitchen in thin, colorless bands, touching the edges of the room without warmth. Mara sat across from him, shoulders drawn inward, hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Coda lay at Caleb's feet, his long body stretched out, head resting against the leg of the table, eyes half open and watchful. Caleb had learned, long ago, that some truths demanded the right posture. You did not rush them. You did not open them standing. He finally reached out and unwrapped the journal, the oilcloth whispering softly as it gave way. The notebook beneath was unremarkable. Brown cover, corners worn smooth, pages thick enough to resist tearing. The kind of thing Owen would have chosen without thought, because it worked. Caleb opened to the first page. There were no confessions, no anger, no fear laid bare. Instead, there were days. Checked the roofline after the wind last night. One loose shingle near the west edge. Fixed it before the rain. Firewood stacked for 2 weeks. Need more if winter comes early. Took Coda down to the beach at dawn. He still runs like he's young when the sand is firm. Caleb felt something in his chest shift, subtle but unmistakable. This was not a man writing to be remembered. This was a man writing to make sure things continued when he was no longer there. He turned pages slowly, the entries forming a quiet rhythm. Repairs, lists, notes about tides and weather. A careful accounting of small, ordinary acts that, taken together, formed a kind of shelter. Owen had been preparing not for death, but for absence. Mara leaned forward without realizing it, her eyes following Caleb's movements, searching his face for signals she was afraid to read on her and on her own. About a third of the way through the notebook, the tone changed, not sharply, but deliberately. "I think loving someone sometimes means deciding what not to say." Caleb's fingers tightened on the page. Owen's handwriting remained steady, the letters evenly spaced, but the words carried a different weight now. "They tried to use her past to control us," Owen had written. "Sent proof, photos, names, timelines. They assumed I would react the way men like them do." Caleb inhaled slowly. "I saw the fear in her before that," the entry continued. "The way her hand freezes when the phone rings late. The way she checks the door twice before bed. You don't need a file to know when someone is running from something." Mara let out a small broken sound, her hand flying to her mouth as if the words had struck her physically. Coda lifted his head, ears angling toward her, then settled again when she did not move. "I knew who she had been," Owen wrote, "and I knew who she was choosing to be. I loved the second woman too much to drag the first one back into the light." Caleb did not look up. He kept reading, because stopping now would have been a kind of cruelty. "If I tell her I know, she will punish herself forever," Owen had written. She will believe she has to earn every quiet moment. I won't do that to her. Love isn't surveillance. It's shelter. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the house itself were leaning in to listen. Owen's words did not accuse. They did not absolve. They simply stood. I stayed quiet because silence, in this case, was mercy, he wrote. If the past has to surface, let it be because she chooses to tell it, not because someone forces her to relive it. Caleb reached the final pages with hands that felt heavier than before. The last entries were shorter, written closer together, as if time had begun to compress. They're pushing harder now. I can hold it a little longer. If this ends badly, tell Caleb I'm not asking him to forgive anyone. I'm asking him to understand. The final entry was dated 2 days before Owen's death. Please don't let Mara become another casualty. She's already paid for a life she didn't want. If someone has to carry blame, let it be me. But don't let her die a second time under it. Caleb closed the journal gently, as if the sound of it snapping shut might fracture something fragile in the room. Mara stared at the table, her breathing shallow, uneven. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet but focused, as if something inside her had finally found a place to land. He knew, she whispered. Caleb nodded once. He did. He never said anything, she said, her voice breaking. He never looked at me like I was. Because he wasn't keeping score, Caleb said quietly. He was keeping you safe. Coda rose then, crossing the small space between them. He rested his head briefly against Mara's knee, not pressing, not insisting, just present. The dog's warmth grounded her, and she placed a trembling hand on his neck, fingers sinking into familiar fur. The moment held, fragile and unrepeatable. The sound of a car outside broke it. Caleb's head lifted instinctively, body already shifting into alertness before his mind caught up. Coda moved to the window, ears forward, posture attentive but calm. A county vehicle pulled into the drive, tires crunching on gravel. Deputy Lila Grant stepped out, her movements economical, deliberate. She was in her late 30s, medium height, with dark hair pulled back into a practical knot and a face that bore the marks of long hours and short patience for nonsense. Her eyes, sharp and observant, took in the house, the yard, the dog at the window before she knocked. Caleb opened the door without waiting. Lila did not waste words. She stepped inside, removing her jacket, her gaze already cataloging the objects on the table. So, she said, this is the part they didn't want found. Caleb handed her the journal, the USB, the repair receipt, the altered contract. Lila took each item carefully, her expression tightening, not with surprise, but with confirmation. This, she said, tapping the repair receipt, puts a name and a date where there shouldn't be one. She glanced at Mara. And your statement fills in the rest. Mara straightened, fear still present, but no longer paralyzing. I'll tell you everything, she said. All of it. Lila nodded once. Good. I can't promise how far this goes, she said. But I can promise it won't be buried again. As Lila gathered the evidence, Caleb felt something inside him shift. Quietly, decisively. The anger he had carried since Owen's death was still there, but it had changed shape. It no longer demanded destruction. It demanded clarity. After Lila left, the house fell back into silence. Caleb stood at the window for a long moment, looking out toward the cliff road, toward the stretch of earth where choices had narrowed into catastrophe. Coda came to his side and sat, shoulder-brushing Caleb's leg. Caleb rested a hand on the dog's head, fingers moving slowly, thoughtfully. The anger was no longer a fire. It was a lamp, and for the first time, it showed him not where to strike but where to stand. Ere too, the case did not resolve itself with the clean satisfaction people expected from stories. There were arrests eventually, quiet ones, a land broker whose paperwork unraveled under scrutiny, a mechanic who stopped answering his phone once the altered brake lines were proven, a man from Mara's past who fled before subpoenas could reach him, leaving behind just enough evidence to ensure he would never fully outrun what he had done. The system moved, slowly and imperfectly, correcting itself in inches rather than miles. Caleb watched it all from the edge. He sat at the kitchen table some mornings, with the radio humming softly beside him, listening to reports that never mentioned Owen's name. He understood why. The truth, once exposed, did not always need to be announced to do its work. Justice, when it came late, preferred quiet. What mattered more was what happened when the noise faded. The real estate papers remained in the glove compartment of Caleb's truck, untouched. At first, he told himself he was waiting for the investigation to finish. Then he realized that explanation no longer fit. Weeks passed. The calls he had planned to make were never dialed. The house stayed. One afternoon, standing beneath the canopy as the wind moved gently through the trees, the realization settled into him with a clarity that felt almost physical. The house was not an inheritance. It was an answer. It had never been about walls or land value. It was a structure built to hold people when systems failed, when storms cut roads, when power lines went dark, when men and women slipped between categories and were quietly abandoned. Owen had known that. Their parents had known it too, in their own quieter way. They had built something meant to endure not comfort, but crisis. Caleb understood then that selling it would not have been closure. It would have been erasure. June Hart returned first. She arrived in her aging pickup one early morning, hair pulled back beneath a knit cap, her movements efficient but unhurried. In her late 40s, June carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who had seen enough damage to respect preparation. Her hands, scarred and steady, had once pulled people from wreckage as an EMT before she traded flashing lights for the quieter demands of veterinary care. They spoke beneath the canopy, voices low. "I can help set protocols," June said. "Medical supplies, triage basics, nothing official." "That's the point," Caleb replied. Elias Whitaker joined them days later, stepping out of the tree line like a man more comfortable among paths than roads. Tall and lean, his beard threaded with gray, Elias moved with the economy of someone who knew how to disappear when needed. As a ranger, he understood the land not as scenery, but as a network. Routes, shelters, places that could save lives if used correctly. "No signage," Elias said. "No announcements. If it looks like a project, it becomes a target." Caleb nodded. "Then it's just a house that's ready." Deputy Lila Grant knew, of course. She always knew. But she also understood restraint. When she visited, she did not bring a badge into the kitchen. She drank coffee, listened, and left without writing anything down. "Call me if someone gets hurt," she said once, standing by the door. "And don't make me regret trusting you." Caleb met her gaze evenly. "I won't." Mara stayed. Not because anyone asked her to, not because forgiveness had been granted cheaply or publicly. She stayed because leaving would have been another form of running, and she was done with that. She moved through the house with quiet purpose, learning its rhythms again without fear. She helped June organize supplies, her hands careful, precise. She took over caring for Coda when Caleb was away, brushing the thick fur along his back, speaking to him softly, as if he were an old friend, rather than a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. The town watched. Some looks were curious. Some were sharp. Mara felt them all, but she did not lower her eyes. She walked straight through the market, stood her ground in conversations, spoke plainly when spoken to. Redemption, she had learned, was not something granted by consensus. It was built day by day through visible choices. Coda changed too. Age showed itself more clearly now. His muzzle had lightened, the black fur giving way to gray. He rose more slowly, paused longer before settling. But his eyes remained alert, his presence steady. He no longer patrolled the edge of the canopy with the rigid vigilance he once had. Instead, he followed Caleb through the property, watching him with the focused attention of someone assessing readiness. One late afternoon, as the light softened and the air grew warm with the promise of summer, Caleb finished securing a supply crate near the house. He turned to find Coda standing several yards away, positioned in front of the old storage shed by the cliff. For a moment, the dog simply looked at him. The wind stirred the trees. The house stood quiet behind them. Then Coda did something he had never done before. He turned away from the shed. No hesitation, no backward glance. He walked toward the house, toward Mara's voice drifting from inside, and lay down near the door, resting his head on his paws as if settling into a well-earned rest. Caleb remained where he was, breath caught in his chest. He understood. The dog had not abandoned his post. He had completed it. The responsibility passed without ceremony, without command, transferred through recognition alone. Whatever Coda had been holding watch for had found its anchor. That night, Caleb sat beneath the canopy as darkness gathered, the forest breathing softly around him. He did not imagine the past. He did not summon memories. He listened to the quiet that followed preparation, the kind of silence that came after something essential had been set in place. Inside, the radio hummed faintly. The fire crackled. Mara moved through the kitchen, unafraid of being seen. Caleb knew there would be no applause for what they had built, no plaque, no headline. And that was right. Some places existed not to be remembered, but to be ready. When he finally stood and went inside, Coda lifted his head briefly, tail thumping once against the floor, then settled again. The house closed around them, steady and unremarkable, prepared for whatever might arrive without warning. There was no victory here, only continuity. A brother who kept a promise not spoken aloud, a woman who lived forward instead of fleeing backward, and a dog who had guided a man to the right side of the light and then trusted him to stay there. Sometimes miracles do not arrive as thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, through a dog that refuses to move, a truth that refuses to stay buried, or a heart that finally chooses responsibility over anger. In faith, we believe God often works this way, not by erasing pain, but by placing the right souls beside it. He sends signs through loyalty, through conscience, through love that stays when walking away would be easier. The miracle is not that suffering disappears, but that it is seen, carried, and answered. In our everyday lives, we are all given moments like this, moments where we can turn away or stand firm, moments where silence is safer, but truth is needed, moments where love asks us not to remember the past, but to protect the future. If this story moved you, let it be a reminder that your choices matter more than your scars. Share this story with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what this story meant to you. Subscribe to Silent Paws Steady Hearts, and help us reach more souls who believe in quiet strength and second chances. May God bless you, guide your steps, protect your loved ones, and place light on your path, especially on the days when the road feels hardest.